Okay, well, thank you so much for coming to the first research seminar for the 2019-2020 academic year. The University of Regina's Statement of Commitment in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 4 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse indigenous peoples, including the Lakota, Cree, and Métis people, whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about my academic work, but more specifically about how my academic work has shaped me as a researcher, as a teacher, and as a person. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd and some people that I don't know, so I really appreciate that you took the time to come today. I want to thank Harold for encouraging me to give this lecture, or rather insisting that I deliver this lecture. And I want to thank Bevan for taking care of the arrangements for the space and making the posters and those kinds of things. Just a funny story to start with. I was asked to deliver this lecture to kind of close out the academic term in April of this year. And I was walking down the hall one day and noticed that I had been bumped for an epidemiologist, which is totally fine if you're needing life-saving measures and population and health. That's awesome. But then when the fall poster came out a few days ago, I noticed I wasn't on that poster either. So I thought maybe I've been bumped again, but I'm here today. So thank you very much for coming. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I do and how long I've been here, etc. So I've been here since 2004, and I teach and research in the area of adaptive physical activity. In the courses I teach, the students and I discuss opportunities for and barriers to leisure, recreation, sport, and active living as they might be experienced by someone who is living with a disability. We seldom talk specifically about medical diagnoses, interventions, or treatments, but rather the factors that might intensify or alleviate the experience of disability, and consider what role we might play in that. We talk about what might determine if someone can live a good life. Sorry, it's like allergies, I'm gonna wipe my nose. Access to education, employment, nutrition, healthcare, friends and family. We talk about the importance of understanding the lived experience, how we can help people compose a life of dignity, and we question our own positioning as the expert and how we deliver practice in someone's life. A great deal of my research enables me to come alongside my friends who are living with a label of intellectual disability. I've come to realize that living with a label imposes a life narrative based on deficits rather than one of strengths. Together, we are trying to shift this story. I could blame this on my allergies, but I'm not. So probably when you see the title of my presentation, you might have some assumptions about what I do. You might assume that I work with narratives or I listen to people's stories, and then I tell stories about people's stories, but it's certainly more complex than that. I do not do narrative inquiry, but I am a narrative inquirer. So what does that mean to be a narrative inquirer? It was a research methodology developed by Jean Clendenin and Michael Connolly, and it is first and foremost a way of thinking about experience. And it's the idea that lived experiences are a source of important knowledge and understanding that people carry with them. It's about thinking with a story, not about a story, by situating lived experience in a three-dimensional space of sociality, so considering social and personal conditions, place, the context or the concrete physical space, and temporality, so considering the past, present, and future, and how all of those dimensions tend to compose somebody's life. In 2000, Clendenin and Connolly published their first book on narrative inquiry, and then Dr. Clendenin, years later, published this much easier to engage with textbook on engaging in narrative inquiry. Another component of narrative inquiry that is really draws me to this methodology is that it's relational. So it really invites the researcher to think about who they are in relation to the story and the people who are living alongside them. So when I invite students, and I'll talk more about that later, to think about narratively in the context of adaptive physical activity, I provide this example to them. So I think about my friend who has a disability, and I wonder how his life has been composed over the last 75 years. What narrative did he have to live by during his time in school, his time in the sheltered workshop, and his time living in a group home? How has the political and social climate composed the lives of people with disabilities? One thing that I can remember particularly well, and I'm not taking a political stand or indicating any kind of political loyalty at this point, but when the Saskatchewan Party came into power a number of years ago, one of the things that they did was they put a lot of funding into programs and services for people with disabilities. And I remember somebody telling me that prior to that, the budgeting formula for food in a group home was based on the number of people who lived in the home. And so each person living in the home was allocated $3 a day for food. If you had 5 people in the home, you were allocated $15 a day for that home for food. And they had lived that way for years and years and years. And when the Sask Party came in and said, you know what, we really need to bump up funding in some of these services, they said, we're going to give you $5 more a day. So everybody in the home was allocated $8 a day for food. And so that was a significant shift in the political landscape and how we started thinking as a society about disability and recognizing that people with disabilities were valuable. I also, think about my friend David, who spends a lot of time in the community. He goes to Pats games, football games, church, and I wonder who walks alongside him in those spaces. And sometimes my own family exists alongside him in those spaces, and I wonder who he is to us and who we are to him. And I wonder how we have shaped one another and recognize that we have a reciprocal effect on our shared stories. So really, narrative inquiry is this really complex web of awakenings. But I was not always a narrative inquirer, and I was not always into stories. I did have a narrative turn a number of years ago. So although I was a qualitative researcher at heart, I can remember sitting in a graduate class during my master's degree at the University of Saskatchewan, and the class was called Qualitative Methods in Education Research or something like that. And I remember hearing about narrative methodology. And what I can remember now about that class that evening was that the professor said, well, sometimes what researchers do is they find people with stories. They document stories. Sometimes the analysis is vague, but somehow it all comes together, maybe into themes. Some researchers will combine participants and their experiences into one fictionalized character or event, and then they'll present the story about it. And then he opened a novel, and he read a passage. And I thought, what is this? How can this possibly be research? In my, at the time, quite narrow positivist view, I thought, how can you actually fictionalize research? How can you present it that way? How is this credible and trustworthy? It makes absolutely no sense. And my arrogant self didn't give stories a second thought. So I continued on with my thesis work, which gave me the opportunity to talk to women with intellectual disabilities about what their leisure experiences were like in group homes. And this work was very meaningful to me because it was my time working in group homes with these particular women that really got me asking, what is leisure really like for them and how do they experience that? And so I thought, this is going to be really easy. I know the women, they know me. I'm going to go in, do my research, get out, it's going to be great. But it turned out to be a lot more difficult than I anticipated. It took a lot of time and energy for the women and I to feel comfortable in our new roles as a researcher and as a participant. And in a way, I felt I had to step away from this trusting friendship I had with them to ensure that the research was objective and thus credible. I felt I had to be distant to be objective and to be a good researcher. And it was almost like we weren't familiar with each other anymore, and we really struggled. At the end of the data collection phase, I didn't have a lot of information from the women, or so I thought. And so when I went to write my results for my thesis, I relied heavily on the observances of the women's leisure experiences that I had seen happening in home and happening in the community. But when I was writing these stories, I took every opportunity possible to include their words, exactly things that they had said, describing their mannerisms and how they communicated. And then in the end, I felt like this is really good, this is great stuff. And I've really done a good job of honoring who these women are. Two things happened, though, during this writing process. I sent my results to my supervisor, and she said, like, whoa, back it up. You have too much information here. You have really just too many stories. And so I had to push some of their stories and words aside because they didn't really fit into my paper or the conceptual framework in which I placed my study. And the second thing that happened was that my supervisor said, you need to prepare yourself for this question. How do you know that what the women said was truthful and credible? And I thought, this is outlandish because I know the only reason why they would ask this question is because the women had a label of intellectual disability. So I was very unsettled by this idea that my committee might not think that the stories the women shared, the stories that they had lived and told, and the stories that I had witnessed and recounted were credible. And I was quite crushed, and I felt like, in a way, I was kind of grieving losing these stories and these happenings that I had witnessed, because I thought, I know these stories are true because they told me, I saw them live those stories, and I lived those stories alongside them. And that's when I began to realize that stories are really important and they matter. So during my PhD program, I had the opportunity to enroll in Jean Clendennin's course, Narrative and Story in Research and Curriculum Studies. So at the beginning of the class, Jean would read a passage from a novel or a poem, but most often she would read a children's book. So titles such as What You Know First, The Table Where Rich People Sit, Reading with Dad, would move me to a point of tears, to the point where we would gather for class on Tuesday evenings at 6:30, and as soon as I sat down at the end of the long table, everyone was throwing the Kleenex boxes at me because they knew that I would be a mess by the end of this short story. But it really made me realize that stories embody me, and I could really feel the words in my bones, and this is how I live. Something else that was significant during my time there was a student who had just kind of come to sit in the class. And he had already finished his PhD program, where he had conducted interviews with his participants. Can't recall exactly what the topic was, but he had conducted the interviews, put the transcripts and whatnot through thematic analysis, and he said he had essentially reduced everyone's experiences into one moment or to one phenomenon. And he was there because he had felt bad that he had disassembled his participants, and he was in Jean's class to learn how to make them whole again. So, what I'm going to share with you today are 5 lessons that I've learned on the narrative inquiry landscape. And so I hope that my insights that I'll share with you might help you become awakened to the value of your own storied life. So storied experience is knowledge. So narrative inquiry methodology is, as I said, is a specific way of thinking about experience. And it's a way of recognizing, respecting, and understanding what we might think of as being an ordinary lived experience. The methodology draws on John Dewey's conceptualization of experience, which suggests that people are individuals and need to be understood as individuals, but they can't only be understood in that way. They're always in relation with someone, something, events, and places. For example, an individual child's learning takes place with other children, with a teacher, in a classroom, in a school, in a community, and so on. And finally, experiences grow out of other experiences, and these experiences lead to further experiences, and somehow it's all tied to what we know from our past, what we're living now, and our imagined future. So there's a thread that really kind of weaves everything together. In the most basic sense, narrative inquiry suggests that experience results through stories that people live and tell as they are influenced by the world around them. In this world, there are several influences. We're influenced by culture, social milieu, institutions, our families, politics, language, and more. So in the research arena, narrative inquiry explores a time influenced by societal conditions within a particular place and the interactions between individuals and others around them. It is a collaboration between researchers and participants over time as they come alongside one another, living in the midst of their own storied lives. We recognize that the researcher and participants, or inquirers as we call them, are shaped by one another. In my own life, narrative inquiry has helped me to make sense of who I am and who I am not. I've become awake to the ways I story myself to others and how others might story me, and it's invited me to think about who I am in relation to others in my and in their world. The second lesson that I've learned is that every story matters. So I've come to believe that if a story is told, it's important. And you might even notice yourself telling the same story to different people at different times in different places for different reasons. And so for you too, every story matters. One of the challenges that I have myself, and I find some of my students have difficulty with too, is that learning to trust that stories do matter. And so I'm going to share just a story with you that might seem insignificant that one of my graduate students wrote about driving home from a baby shower with her daughter in the back seat. So if we think with the story, we can certainly learn from it. It's Sunday evening, and Lauren, my 3-year-old daughter, and I are on our way home from a baby shower that my friend Caitlin has hosted. Sitting in her car seat, Lauren starts to make a growling sound. I look in the rearview mirror and I ask, "Lauren, what are you doing?" She sleepily replies, "Mama, I'm trying to sound like Caitlin." Sorry, I know what's going to happen, so I'm like all teary-eyed. So Caitlin is a young woman who lives with complex physical disability. She has cerebral palsy, a disorder of posture and movement caused by a lesion on the immature brain. Cerebral palsy can cause one's muscles to be in a constant state of spasticity. Caitlin uses a manual wheelchair for mobility, relying on others to push her chair when she wants or needs to go somewhere. She does not use spoken word for communication. She communicates by vocalizing sounds and also nods her head for yes and shakes her head for no. Caitlin and I are friends, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to be included in the baby shower. I explained to Lauren that some of Mommy's friends communicate in other ways than using words. Lauren stares at me intently with a scowl on her face, and she says, "Like how you give me angry eyes when you want me to stop doing something?" And I say, "Yes, Lauren, exactly like that," I proudly answer. A few moments later, Lauren's fast asleep, and it's well past her bedtime. Based on what can be seen and what cannot be seen, I wonder if most people assume Caitlin cannot communicate. If one takes the time to get to know Caitlin, you quickly learn that she is a great communicator, something that Lauren learned in one short evening. The third lesson is that we story one another. So we story other people just as they story us. And there's 3 points that I'd like to make here. The first one is that we tell the stories we tell others about who we are. And so we might not realize it, but these stories are probably the most work for us because we have a lot of stories to tell. We story ourselves differently to our life partners, our children, our colleagues, our parents, friends, and to students. Sometimes still on the first day of class, I feel like I have to make a decision about how I'm going to story myself to students. Am I going to be inviting, flexible, and approachable, or am I going to be firm, serious, and distant? Second are the stories that we let others tell us about who we are. They are good stories that other people tell us about who we are. I've been storied as a loving mother, a leader in my community, a thoughtful scholar, and a passionate teacher. But some stories we let others tell us about who we are not so good. I've been storied as a laissez-faire mother when my daughter doesn't go to bed at the time other 7-year-old children should. I've been storied as being too involved in my community, a slow professor, and a difficult instructor. I try to hold on to the good stories so I can live by them. The trouble is that the bad stories are the easiest to believe and the hardest to forget. And so I remember having this conversation recently with a colleague about course evaluations. And I can remember, years ago when I got my first course evaluations, I was really excited because I thought the course had went really well. And out of the 25 written comments, there were 2 that were really bad. And those were the 2 that I tended to remember. And so I have to make a conscious decision to really kind of hold on to the good stories. But the stories that I want you to think about today are the stories that we tell others about who they are. And so I'm going to share a couple of my experiences with you. So the first story I'm going to tell you is a story about my friend Lola, who I met when I was working at a sheltered workshop in the city. And I had done that off and on for a few years before my time here in the faculty. And so once I became a faculty member, I used that opportunity to engage community groups to come onto campus and to hang out with students. And it was there was some nice reciprocity in that relationship. Everybody got together and they got to learn about new people, try new activities, and learn how to feel comfortable in this shared space. Well, one of the women who came for the practicum experience from the workshop was Lola. And I remembered her because I always looked forward to seeing her every day. She had a very eclectic wardrobe with a lot of jazzy accessories. Every day I would see her, she would have bright colored pants and a patterned shirt, and she'd have lots of necklaces and rings and hairbands and bows and everything kind of going on, and she'd have this really nice purse with her, and I just always looked forward to seeing her, and she was lots of fun, and she told jokes, and she was great. So the first day that the gang from the activity center came onto campus for the practicum, I met the bus outside, and I was watching everybody come off, hello, 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 and I knew several other people, and then I saw Lola get off the bus, and I was really so pleased to see her. But she seemed a little bit upset, a little bit out of sorts. And so I went to the staff, one of the staff person, and I said, hey, is everything okay? Like, you guys got here okay? I kind of noticed Lola seems a little bit down. Is she okay? And they said, yeah, no, she's fine. She's just nervous. It's a new space and whatever. Okay, fine. So at the end of the day, the end of the hour class, everybody gets back in the bus and they go back to the center, and I send an email to the staff person and I say, well, hey, the students had a great time. I hope, everyone at your end had a great time. Is there anything we could do to make things better the next day? And they said, no, everything was fantastic. So they come back a couple of days later, and I'm greeting everyone getting off the bus, and Lola gets off the bus and she looks a little distraught again. And so I say to her support person, are you sure everything's okay? Yeah, she's fine. Although she did cry the whole way back to the activity center the first day. I thought, oh my gosh, what's going on? So I got a chance to talk to Lola, and I said, hey, how's it going? Are you doing okay? And she said, yeah, this is great. I'm having a great time. Well, I said, somebody said that you were a little upset, kind of going back to work the other day, and I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. And she said, no, everything is fantastic. It's great because you invited me to school. Sorry. She said, I've never been to school before. No one ever told me that I could go to school. Last week was my first day of school. Today is my second day of school. Thank you for inviting me. Did you know, she says, that I am 62 years old? And I thought, wow, this is how she's been storied. That she wasn't worthy of school, she wasn't worthy of having the experience that other children got to have. And I thought maybe what's worse is that she knows that she's been storied this way. So I realized at that point that as academics, we have the opportunity to impact people by the stories we share, but also by the stories that we tell other people about who they are. And if we can have the opportunity, perhaps we can help recompose a narrative that others have had to live by, a narrative that eliminated choice, opportunity, growth, and dignity. At the very least, we need to learn from it. The next lesson is that some stories never change, but perhaps, maybe, we can learn to live with them in an educative way. So in narrative inquiry research, when we talk about feelings of unease, or if we're like this, we talk about experiencing tensions. And tensions are understood in a relational way. So tensions that might exist between people and events and things are just a way of creating space for us to really kind of think about them. And in my writing and pedagogy, I share stories of tension that I lived when I was working in the community. So I will take you back to 25-ish years ago with one of my first roles working in the community. And I was hired as a support in a recreation program for kids children and youth who had autism. And I was assigned to work with this young man named Raymond. And Raymond was what they described as being at the high end of the spectrum. He communicated only using vocalizations. He had a lot of repetitive behaviors. He wandered constantly. He transitioned poorly, so from activity to activity or space to space, and on and on and on. So he had this whole kind of file or description of deficits about who he was. So on the first day, rolled out and we engaged in our activities, and mostly what I did that first morning was follow Raymond around the school building that we had booked for the activities. And he was a run risk. He was a runner, that's what they called him. I had to make sure he didn't exit the building. And so at lunchtime came, everybody grabbed their lunch, and two staff of the program, or my superiors, said, okay, take Raymond and his lunch and put him in that room over there. You guys are having lunch in that room. I'm thinking, okay, he has difficulty eating with other people. Maybe it's the smells or the sounds or whatever, that's fine. And so I went into the room and I was waiting, and the two supervisors come in and they shut the door and they say, okay, well, part of Raymond's program is to learn to sit and eat his meals. I said, okay. And so what happened was they brought Raymond over to a table and a chair. They set him in a chair, and then they used lots of kind of verbal cues to try to get him to eat. Raymond, eat. Raymond, eat. Raymond, pick up the sandwich. Raymond, eat. Lots of things. And he wasn't doing that. And he was wanting to get out of the chair, and they kept kind of forcing him down. And so that didn't last for too long, because what ended up happening was my two supervisors held Raymond down into the chair and asked me to force this butter and bologna sandwich into his mouth. And so through his pursed lips, I was pushing this gross, mangled sandwich in his mouth, trying to get him to eat. And the point was that he would learn to sit and eat. This is a normalization program that they had. And I was very upset by that. The rest of the afternoon didn't go good. I went back the next day, the same thing happened, and then I quit because I couldn't do it. It wasn't in my bones. I didn't have the ability to continue to do that work. And it's really bothered me ever since. I have tensions with that, and I know I do because the students who are here who have had classes with me probably remember me telling this story. Well, fast forward 25 years, I had the opportunity to take some students to a space that supported children and youth who had a lot of complex needs. There were kids with what they would define as medical complexity, so they might be fed through a GI tube, they might be on ventilators, There were kids who were physically complex, so had severe spastic cerebral palsy, or were relied on wheelchairs and others to move them. There were kids who were described as being very complex developmentally, had a lot of problem behaviors, all this kind of stuff. But the value, I thought, in being invited into that space was that students would get to see how an interdisciplinary team works. So there's teachers, social workers, therapists, nurses, a lot of people in this space. And so the students and I went to this environment, and students were assigned to different rooms, and they hung out with students, and everything seemed to be going okay. But incidentally, our class was scheduled over the lunch hour. And so we were there from 11:30 to 12:30, and there was a few students who were asked to have lunch with a little boy named Matthew. And so Matthew was 3 years old, and he had a severe developmental disability, they called it. So he had a lot of kind of problem behaviors. They were trying to teach him certain skills. He didn't use speech as his main form of communication. There was lots of things that they were working on with him. And so what happened during lunchtime is Matthew came out of the classroom. He didn't eat with the rest of his peers. And beside the classroom was this little closet. And so the teacher pulls out a table and a chair. So Matthew sits down on the chair, and they push the table up to him, but the table has like a cutout in it. So the table's right up against him. Something else odd about this table is that it has a buckle on it. And so they buckle the table behind the chair. And so he's essentially restrained in the table and chair to have lunch. And they start feeding him his lunch. And he's screaming and crying, and he wants to get away, and he has the biggest tears I've ever seen coming down his face. I tried not to have the same tears coming down my face, tried to keep it together for the students. There was a group of 4 students. 3 of them were like just kind of standing there in awe, not sure what to do. Another student left because she had difficulty being in that space. And so anyways, we left and whatever, and I told the students I would follow up and kind of find out, kind of what was going on. And so I contact one of the staff the next day. Is it, making sure everything's okay? Could we come back? Whatever. I had some students who had some questions about Matthew and his lunchtime. And they were just kind of wondering, how, if they could be supportive in some way, or maybe just kind of, why he had to have lunch away from the others. And this person said, that's part of his lunch program. He has to learn to sit and eat. Nobody walks around eating, and if he wants to go to a restaurant one day, he's going to have to learn to sit down. And I thought, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. I think back to my own familial space, and I think about how my daughter probably eats best when she's walking around. Otherwise, she sits on her chair at the dinner table like she's off in the Amazing Race or something. She's going to bolt at any second. And then I was also told that, this is a lot of work for us to do this lunch program because his parents won't do it at home. They refuse to do any of this work, so we have to do all of it. And then I thought, this is how this group is storying these parents, and they might not know really what's going on. So it was really quite upsetting to me. And I was thinking about how Matthew's story can inform me. And of course, I think back to my time with Raymond and how I was so troubled by his lunch program. It makes sense to me now. I don't like it. But what Matthew's story does is it helps me to live with the tensions because I can make sense of it now. And I also realize that there are stories that are bigger than us that are difficult to recompose. But really what we can do is learn from it. And the final lesson is that we can't value someone's knowledge if we don't ask for stories. So in pedagogy, I've used narrative inquiry to invite students to become awake to their storied lives, which, unbeknownst to us, are very complex. Narrative inquiry can also help students and the professors realize that when students arrive to our classes, they carry with them valuable knowledge. But as professors, we never know this because we don't ask. It's not the nature of academia to ask our young undergraduate students, what do you know and what can you teach me? So a couple of years ago, I began asking students, what stories are important to you? What experiences in your life have led you to this field? And more specifically, what events or people or places in your life have shaped what you think about that experience of disability? And so when students are invited to engage in this work, they follow a process that's similar to what would be done when we engage in narrative inquiry methodology. The first step is to construct a timeline of significant events. So a lot of students do this chronologically. They'll take a piece of paper and, write birth to whatever, and they'll write down kind of those moments that they lived in school and in their community and in their family, where they had moments where they engaged with or walked alongside someone who is experiencing diversity. Some students go so far as to create some kind of artifact to represent what they have come to learn about the experience of disability. So I brought a few of them here today. This first one was a student whose father has a brain injury and has some memory loss. And so what she did was she created this as kind of diorama of him, I guess, and wrote memories and moments that were important to her and, things that they shared, rolled them up in a little scroll and in a way kind of returned them to him so that in a way they could be brought back together or he could have those again. Another student who was a woodworker, he just whipped this up on the weekend, he said, created like a puzzle piece or a puzzle, and on the back of each piece is a picture of someone that's important to him, and with all of these moments and events and people, he's put them together to represent how he has come to understand what disability means. This young gal was an artist, and she, I don't know if you can see, there's an armadillo at the bottom of the picture, and she said that that's how she felt for a long time. She said she was a very sensitive person, and she was always told, like, don't be upset, don't be a crier. I was probably told that too. But she said so she walked around with this kind of shell on her, and people thought that she was not engaging and she was, always upset or cold or distant or something. But what she was doing was just protecting herself. And so she realized through some of this adaptive coursework and working with people that there's strength in being vulnerable. And so this is her emerging. And then this other painting, a gal combined a few elements of experiences that she's had. I don't know if you can come look at it later, but the road at the bottom leads to a curling rink, and it was her experience playing wheelchair curling that was very impactful for her. Then she has part of the face is a notebook, her taking notes in the intro to adaptive physical activity and recreation course, taking in a lot of information and learning. The light bulb of the right eye is kin 241, she said, where she was really like, wow, this is really amazing. She had a lot of things going on thinking about. And then a couple of the other elements represent the top of the head with the brain and the smoke or fogginess represents her grandmother who's living with dementia. So these are just a few of the samples of work that I get from students when they're invited to engage to think narratively. There's several more examples, but I just didn't find enough colleagues to carry them over today. So they create a timeline and they create an artifact to represent that. And then the second step is to pick one or two events and to think about those events or moments in the three-dimensional framework, so temporality, place, and sociality. And when students are invited to do this, they respond in one of two ways. The first way is, I have no stories to tell. I have no experience with disability. There were no kids in my school or my class. There was no one in my neighborhood or my town. No one in my family has a disability. How do you expect me to do this work? And so when I hear this, I'm hopeful, because I think maybe this is the generation of people who are surrounded by disability, but they don't notice it because it's just part of the fabric of their everyday life. And so if that is the case, I get a little bit nervous because now what I've asked them to do is to think about that person or that event or whatever in a different way. In other instances, When students literally say, no, there was no one with a disability in my life, I ask them to think about that. Why do you think there was such an absence of diversity? And then another way that students respond is they say, when can I get started? So as the semester comes to an end, I pick a day where students can come by my office and drop off assignments. And they stop by and they, with these beautiful projects and these beautiful, this beautiful writing, and they're like, hey, how are you? Thanks for the semester. When are marks going to be posted and whatever? And then they walk away. And then the next day, I come into my office, I close my door, and I start to read. My mother first acquired her medically recognized disability in 2000 after a near fatal encounter with carbon monoxide poisoning. Although I do not remember the house fire, one that she caused, I do recall her diagnosis of vascular dementia. In addition, my mother has been addicted to opiates since grade 9, with her mother supplying these opiates to mask the chronic injuries that she sustained from competitive figure skating. For this paper, I'll elaborate on my mother's admission to the hospital earlier this year for isopropyl alcohol ingestion. In the year 2000, my mother experienced carbon monoxide poisoning that severely damaged the impulse control region of her frontal cortex. This resulted in years of prescription medication abuse, theft of pain medication from my neighbors' houses, and when the pills weren't enough, the introduction of alcohol into the mix. A couple of years ago, my mother ingested 150 mils of Purell hand sanitizer just to take the edge off. She entered a psychosis, smashing dishes, punching walls, and microwaving empty bowls, complaining that the spaghetti won't heat up. We had the RCMP and paramedics escort her to the hospital, where it was revealed that her blood alcohol content by percent was 0.6. This is almost double the sufficient concentration to kill, or at very least result in a coma. I experienced the situation much differently than my father. As I approached the situation calmly, I examined it like a medical case study. I considered the symptom load, tested blood sugar, neurological functions, and I called the paramedics. I was not scared of the events unfolding, but I later realized that this is because I did not recognize her as my own mother at the time. Events similar to this have happened before, and I was able to recognize the symptom load and initiate the course of action. The same could not be said of my father. He saw the pressing concern was not to alert the neighbors to what was happening. My parents had hidden my mother's addiction and alcoholism from my neighbors to avoid embarrassment and social exclusion. This social self-preservation nearly cost my mother her life. It is this very ignorance and tendency to hide medical conditions that plagues the social fabric of our society today. In my timeline, there's a picture in the summer of 2010 featuring my entire family. In the picture, you can see two elderly persons, one with a cane and one without, and then I have my uncle there who also has a disability, as well as my great-grandmother. They can be visually identified as experiencing instability and a degree of disability. But what you cannot see is that there are 11 alcoholics beside them who have been fired from their jobs, divorced, or lost custody of their children. After the isopropyl alcohol incident, my mother attended rehabilitation, and once again, my parents were forced on creating stories about my mother going on a holiday with her sister for 6 weeks instead of being open about our family challenges. I approached the situation openly and honestly, telling my neighbors and girlfriend what happened. I received mixed responses. My mother's friends said they had known for a while about her addiction, but they're happy that she's getting treatment. Our neighbors were very happy, too, that she was getting treatment, and they apprehensively told me that they had caught my mother on camera breaking into their houses, stealing alcohol and pain meds. My girlfriend said to me, "You're going to be an addict just like your mother." We all become our parents. My extended family told my father and I that we were liars and that my mother does not have a problem with addiction or alcoholism. The story fragments have influenced the core of my being and have forever changed the way I approach the topic of disability and addiction. To discuss the impact and beliefs, attitudes, and values that have originated from these stories, I've created a list of guidelines that I use in my interactions, and I will use these guidelines to guide my perspective moving forward in the field of adaptive physical activity. These guidelines are the summation of my life experiences to date. And these tenets resonate with all stories expressed here, as well as in any of the disability programming, adaptive sport, class presentations, or other opportunities I have had the privilege of taking part in over the past few years of my undergraduate program. And so the student lists guidelines that they've developed for interacting with people. Everyone is a human and a human first. We are a product of our environment, but we don't have to become what others see of us. If you make a positive impact on someone's life, they will remember you. Help those who want to be helped, not those who see you as ripe. Help those who want to be helped, not those who you see as ripe for change. Ask before you help. Empathize, do not sympathize. Although you may be the caregiver, you can ask for help too. And finally, you are not the expert, but you may be able to help find the solution. So this is just an example of writing that I received from one student. And this student, like a lot of other students, have been engaged in the curriculum of adaptive physical activity, exercise physiology, biomechanics, anatomy, psychology, motor learning, and so on. But perhaps this student's most important curriculum is the curriculum of life. Learning to navigate support systems, care for his family, manage relationships, negotiate tensions, and so on. So, my final thoughts. Consider how you story the people in your life, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your students, etc. What story are you telling them about who they are? Are they valued? Are they worth it? And do they matter? Consider asking unlikely teachers to inform you. Everyone carries knowledge with them, but we won't learn unless we ask. I am always surprised at what students will share and what they will teach me when they are given the opportunity to just write about who they are and what stories have shaped them. And remember that every story matters, even your own stories. So take the time to tell yourself a good story about who you are and thank those in your life who have storied you well. Thank you.